Pronation and cupping are two very essential tools to an arm wrestler's arsenal. They're directly opposing forces on the table. Cupping is used to turn your opponent's palm up and expose their arm, while pronation is used to prevent that from happening. Many people argue about which one is more important, but whatever your stance may be on that topic, this video isn't about that. The purpose of this video is to talk about the relationship between pronation and cupping. Now at this point, you might be a little confused. Huh? Didn't I already say what their relationship is? Cupping is used to turn your opponent's palm up and expose their arm, while pronation is used to prevent that. Well, that's just one part of it. There is another aspect to how cupping and pronation affect one another that not many people realize or talk about. But before I go into that, I want to talk about how the position of the forearm affects the wrist. Now, if you've been arm wrestling, or at least have been observing arm wrestling for a decent amount of time, you may have noticed that a lot of times, hook pullers tend to dive in and supinate their arm. Some of you may remember I talked a little bit about how to force a hook with supination in a previous video. Using supination of your own. So, this chopping motion, chopping in, is another way to set a hook. Chopping directly into your opponent's pronator, turning them palm up, and you can even do this without curling your wrist. So you can set a hook without a wrist curl just by going in like this. Now in that video, I didn't really go deeply as to why they do this, but turns out there are actually anatomical reasons for it. And that is because our cupping or wrist flexion is actually stronger in the supinated position. This fact, I think, is probably the most obvious one that I'll be talking about in this video, and most of you probably already knew about it just from your own experience arm wrestling and gripping up on the table. But I think it's also cool that there is some scientific literature backing it up as well. And in that same study, they also found another interesting thing. Wrist extension is stronger in the pronated position. So remember how we talked about the wrist kickback in a previous video? Well, evidently, since wrist extension is stronger in the pronated position, it may be a reason why Devin has talked about it quite a bit, especially in the context of fighting for height and position.
There are times when you are in the middle, you are driving upwards, and your ability to just bend your wrist back just slightly is going to force your opponent to hold on to you.
And the point of first bringing up all these facts is that I wanted to impress upon you that there is a lot of evidence showing a connection between movements in the wrist and movements in the forearm, which is what pronation is part of. We also know that muscle contraction force is greatly influenced by the length it is stretched or shortened. Specifically, a muscle is weakest when fully stretched or fully shortened. And I'm sure most of us have experienced this too when doing various exercises where it's hard at the beginning of the movement, then it gets easier before becoming harder again towards the end. Now, with all that aside, I want to move on to what I really want to focus on for this video, which is how pronation and cupping are interrelated, at least in an arm wrestling context. The earlier study we saw didn't really touch on this, but there is another study that I found which exactly covers what I'm going to talk about, which is the fact that pronation is stronger when your wrist is flexed compared to when it's extended. To demonstrate what I mean by this, of course, we're going to go back to everyone's favorite Devin Larratt pronation lift. So, in the first clip, you're going to see me doing the lift with a flexed wrist, meaning that my wrist is cupped in. And as you just saw, that was a pretty easy lift.
But wait, there's more.
But now, Watch me do the exact same weight, but with an extended or kicked back wrist, and you'll see the difference. And now you know why those hardcore form police are always droning on and on about having to keep your wrist straight or slightly bent back when doing the lift. Because it makes a big difference. As for the exact reasons as to why this is the case, I can only speculate because there hasn't been much research into that I've found. One guess is that wrist extension might somehow put a stretch on the pronator teres, because we know that the superficial wrist flexor muscles and pronator teres muscle all attach at the same common flexor tendon. And as we know, being in a stretched position weakens a muscle's force of contraction. In my case, with a cupped wrist, I can comfortably do 50 kilos or so. But as you just saw, I could barely budge 40 kilos with my wrist kicked back. And coincidentally enough, the research showed that in a neutral forearm position, the difference in percentage of pronation strength is about 25% between the fully flexed and fully extended positions. Now with that in mind, this is the interesting part, how it affects arm wrestling on a practical level. Now that we know if you get your wrist bent back, your pronation is going to become weaker, and it can explain this pretty common phenomenon that I've observed from watching top rollers and also being a primarily top roll puller myself. Once you're able to take your opponent's hand, it suddenly becomes easier to get your cup. As someone who has a relatively weak cup, I found that not always, but a lot of times, even if I've lost my cup to an opponent or I couldn't secure it, after I've taken their wrist, I can still come back and regain my cup afterwards. And that is probably explained by them being put into a position where their pronation strength has become weaker. Now with all that being said, there is one caveat to this. The flop wrist press. Effective flop pressers are able to use their frame to force themselves into a pronated position, and if you have tried it before, you know how extremely hard it is to turn a flop presser palm up once they have already set their press. At that point, you're basically just twisting their palm, but their forearm doesn't really twist along with it. And this is why some people grip a little bit lower against a flop presser so that they can cup and twist their forearm as well. But guys, the point I wanted to bring home with this video is that even if you may be lacking in one fundamental, it is still possible to make up for it if you're stronger somewhere else. As this video has demonstrated, and I have personally experienced, even though my wrist isn't the strongest one out there, because I have really good pronation, I'm able to make my opponent's pronation weaker and consequently allow my own cup to be relatively enough. So guys, let me know what your thoughts on this topic are. Do you have stronger pronation or stronger cupping? Let me know all your numbers in the comment section below. Which one do you think is more important? I'm Greg, and I'll see you in the next one.